They say freezing to death is like falling asleep. They're lying. It burns. It feels like 1,000 knives slicing through your skin before the darkness takes you. Ethan thought he was just saving a helpless child from the icy Chicago River. He didn't know that the boy drowning in the dark water was the heir to the Valenti crime family. He didn't know that pulling him out would drag him under, into a world of silencers, billion-dollar secrets, and an alpha who could burn the city to the ground for his son. He saved the boy's life, but he was about to find out that might have been his fatal mistake. This is the drowning. The receipt crumbled in Ethan Sullivan's hand. $48. That was his take-home for a double shift at Jerry's Diner on 35th Street. It wasn't enough to cover the heating bill, let alone the rent that was 3 weeks overdue. The Chicago wind in November was a physical assault. It whipped off Lake Michigan, cutting through his threadbare denim jacket and biting into his skin. Ethan adjusted his scarf, ducking his head as he walked along the Wacker Drive Bridge. It was 2 a.m. The city was asleep, save for the distant hum of traffic on the I-90 and the occasional siren wailing like a dying animal in the distance. He stopped for a moment, looking over the railing at the Chicago River. It looked like black oil, churning silently below. Just one break, he whispered, his breath puffing out in a white cloud. I just need one break. He was about to turn away when he heard it. Not a scream, but a splash. Heavy and unnatural. Ethan squinted into the darkness below. The river walk was deserted, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the street lamps. Then he saw the taillights of a black SUV, no plates, peeling away from the lower service road, tires screeching against the asphalt. And there, bobbing in the freezing current, was a patch of beige. A coat. A small coat. Oh my God, Ethan gasped. He didn't think. If he had thought, he would have remembered that he was 24, broke, and had no health insurance. He would have remembered that the river temperature was hovering near 40 degrees. He scrambled down the maintenance stairs, his boots slipping on the icy metal. When he reached the concrete edge, he saw him, a boy no older than 6, thrashing weakly. The heavy wool coat he was wearing was dragging him down. Hey, hold on. Ethan screamed, his voice tearing at his throat. The boy's head went under. He didn't come back up. Ethan kicked off his boots. He took a breath that tasted of exhaust and freezing rain, and he dove. The shock was immediate. It hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. The cold paralyzed his lungs, squeezing the air out of him. His limbs felt heavy instantly, his jeans soaking up the water like lead weights. Move, he screamed internally. Move or die? He kicked downward, eyes stinging in the murky filth. He groped blindly in the dark until his fingers brushed against something, soft wool. He grabbed the collar of the coat and kicked for the surface. His lungs were burning, screaming for oxygen. They broke the surface, and Ethan gasped, sucking in air that felt like broken glass. The boy was limp in his arms. No, 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 Ethan chanted, dragging him towards the concrete embankment. He hauled him up onto the freezing pavement, scraping his palms raw. He dragged himself up after him, collapsing beside his small body. The boy was pale, his lips blue. He looked like a porcelain doll, broken and discarded. Ethan immediately started CPR. Come on, he gritted out, pressing down on the small chest. Don't you do this. Don't you die on me. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing. 1, 2, 3, 4. He pinched the boy's nose and breathed into his mouth. The taste of river water and copper filled his senses. Breathe, he screamed, tears of frustration and cold freezing on his cheeks. Breathe, damn it. A convulsion shook the small body. The boy gagged, turned his head, and vomited water onto the concrete. Ethan fell back, sobbing with relief. Okay, you're good. I got you. The boy looked at him. His eyes were dark, terrified, and incredibly old for a childish face. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just shivered violently. Ethan pulled him into his lap, trying to share his body heat, though he had none left to give. He fumbled for a phone in his wet pocket. Dead. Waterlogged. Help! He screamed toward the bridge above. Someone help. Minutes felt like hours. The boy's shivering was slowing down, a bad sign. Hypothermia was setting in. Ethan hugged him tighter, rocking him. Stay awake, he chattered, his teeth clattering together. What's your name? I'm Ethan. Can you tell me your name? The boy remained silent. His small hand gripped Ethan's wet shirt with a strength that surprised him. Finally, lights. Blue and red, flashing against the limestone of the bridge. An ambulance siren cut through the night. Over here, Ethan yelled, waving a freezing arm. 2 paramedics rushed down the stairs, followed by a police officer. They swarmed the boy, wrapping him in thermal blankets, putting an oxygen mask on his face. He was under for maybe 30 seconds. Ethan stammered, his vision blurring. I saw a car drive away. We got him, sir, one paramedic said, lifting the boy onto a stretcher. The boy reached out for Ethan, his eyes wide with panic as they pulled him away. Wait. Ethan tried to stand, but his legs gave out. The world tilted sideways. The adrenaline crashed, leaving only the cold. The last thing he saw was the flashing red lights reflecting off the black water before the darkness swallowed him whole. When Ethan woke up, it was to the smell of antiseptic and the beep of a monitor. He blinked, his eyes gritty. He was in a hospital bed wearing a scratchy gown. A heavy wool blanket was tucked up to his chin. Northwestern Memorial. He recognized the view out the window. He used to clean floors here 2 years ago. A nurse in blue scrubs bustled in. Oh good, you're awake. You gave us a scare, honey. Severe hypothermia. Ethan sat up, ignoring the headache that throbbed behind his eyes. The boy, he croaked, his throat feeling like sandpaper. How is the boy? The nurse paused, checking Ethan's foredrip. She frowned. The boy. The kid I pulled out of the river. Ethan said, urgency rising in his chest. Is he okay? He was so cold. The nurse looked at him with an expression of genuine confusion. Honey, you were brought in alone. The police report said a patrol car found you passed out on the river walk. There was no boy. Ethan froze. What? No, I pulled him out. The paramedics took him first. He was wearing a beige coat. Burberry, I think. The nurse patted his hand patronizingly. Trauma can do funny things to the memory. You were hallucinating from the cold. There was no record of a child admission last night from your sector. I'm not crazy. Ethan snapped, ripping the tape off his hand to adjust the 4. He was there. I did CPR on him. Mr. Sullivan, please, calm down, or I'll have to call security, the nurse said firmly. Rest. You're lucky to be alive. The nurse left the room. Ethan sat in the silence, his heart pounding against his ribs. He looked at his hands. They were scraped raw, the skin red and angry. He closed his eyes, and he could still feel the weight of him, the smell of the expensive wool, the terror in those dark eyes. He wasn't crazy. He swung his legs out of bed. He needed to leave. He needed to find out what happened. As he reached for his clothes, which were folded neatly on a chair, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. It must have been tucked into the pocket of his jeans, which were now dry and stiff. Ethan picked it up. It wasn't paper, it was a card. Heavy, cream-colored stock, expensive. There was no name, just a symbol embossed in black ink, a wolf with a dagger in its jaws. And a phone number, written in sharp, angular handwriting. On the back, 3 words, for your silence. Ethan stared at the card. The nurse said there was no boy. The police report said he was alone. But someone had put this in his pocket while he was unconscious. He wasn't crazy. He had saved someone important. And apparently, someone very powerful wanted the world to think that boy was dead. 3 days later, Ethan was back at Sal's pit stop. He hadn't called the number. He had shoved the card into a jewelry box, an old cigar box under his bed, and tried to forget it. But his life had a way of not letting him forget things. Ethan, table 4 needs a refill, and stop daydreaming. Sal bellowed from the kitchen window. Sal was a sweaty alpha who smelled of onions and old grease. On it, Sal, Ethan muttered, grabbing the coffee pot. He felt like he was being watched. He had felt it ever since he left the hospital, a prickly sensation on the back of his neck. When he walked home, he saw cars slowing down. When he was in his apartment, he heard footsteps in the hallway that stopped right outside his door. He poured coffee for a trucker who winked at him. He ignored him. As he turned to head back to the counter, the bell above the diner door jingled. The noise in the diner didn't stop, but the atmosphere changed instantly. It was as if the air pressure dropped. 2 men walked in. They were out of place. Sal's was a place for flannel shirts, work boots, and desperation. These men wore suits that cost more than the building. Italian cut, charcoal gray, tailored to hide the holsters Ethan knew were there. They didn't look for a table. They looked at him. One of them, a mountain of an alpha with a scar running through his left eyebrow, walked straight to the counter. "Ethan Sullivan?" he asked. His voice was like gravel grinding together. "Who's asking?" Ethan gripped the coffee pot handle tighter, using it as a shield. "Our employer would like a word," the man said. It wasn't a request. "I'm on shift," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "And I don't know your employer. He knows you. He knows you went swimming the other night." Ethan's blood ran cold. The diner suddenly felt very small. Sal poked his head out of the kitchen, saw the suits, saw the grim expressions, and immediately ducked back in. "Coward," Ethan thought. "I don't want any trouble," Ethan whispered. "Then come with us," the man said. "The car is outside." Ethan looked out the grease-stained window. A matte black Mercedes G-Wagon was idling at the curb. "And if I say no?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Sullivan, you hold a debt. We are just here to collect." Ethan knew then that he didn't have a choice. If they wanted to hurt him, they would have done it already. They wanted something else. "Let me get my coat," he said. The drive took 40 minutes. They headed north, away from the grime of the city, towards the sprawling estates of Lake Forest. The houses here weren't houses. They were fortresses of stone and glass, hidden behind iron gates and high hedges. The car turned into a driveway that looked more like a private road. They passed a security checkpoint where armed guards nodded at the driver. The estate that came into view was terrifyingly beautiful. It was a modern Gothic manor, dark stone and sharp angles, looming against the gray sky. The car stopped. The scarred man opened her door. Inside. Library. Second door on the left. Ethan walked up the steps, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The front doors opened before he touched them. The interior was vast, cold, and silent. Marble floors reflected his cheap sneakers. He walked to the library, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. The room was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. A fire roared in a massive stone hearth, the only source of warmth in the house. Standing by the window with his back to him was an alpha. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained against his white dress shirt. He held a tumbler of amber liquid in one hand. "Sit," he commanded. His voice was low, baritone, and vibrated through the room. Ethan remained standing. "I prefer to stand." The man turned around. Ethan's breath hitched. He was devastatingly handsome in a way that was almost painful to look at. High cheekbones, a sharp jawline covered in a shadow of stubble, and eyes that were the color of storm clouds, gray and turbulent. But his face was etched with exhaustion and a simmering, controlled rage. This was Dante Valenti. He knew the face. Everyone in Chicago knew the face, though usually it was on the news regarding alleged racketeering charges that never stuck, or charity galas that were fronts for money laundering. The head of the Valenti crime syndicate, the Capo di Tutti Capi. "You are younger than I expected," Dante said, his eyes scanning him, dissecting him. "And poorer. I work for a living." Ethan snapped. his fear momentarily replaced by defensiveness. Unlike some people, Dante's eyes narrowed. He took a sip of his drink. You have a sharp tongue. Be careful not to cut yourself with it. He walked over to a desk and picked up a tablet. He tapped the screen and turned it toward him. It was a grainy video, security footage. It showed the river walk. It showed the boy falling. It showed Ethan diving in. It showed him saving him. I watched this 50 times, Dante said quietly. My security team, they failed. My son was taken from his bed, drugged, and thrown off a bridge by a rival faction. They intended to send me a message. A dead air. He set the tablet down. But you, he stepped closer, invading his personal space. Ethan could smell him, sandalwood, whiskey, and danger. You ruined their message. I just did what anyone would do, Ethan said, backing up until his legs hit a leather armchair. No, Dante corrected. Most people would have walked away or filmed it for social media. You jumped into near-freezing water. Where is he? Ethan asked. The boy, Leo. He remembered seeing the name in the papers years ago. Dante's expression softened, just for a fraction of a second. He is alive. Physically, he is recovering. Mentally, he trailed off, the mask of the cold boss slipping. He has not spoken a word since that night. He screams if anyone touches him. Doctors, nurses, even me. He looked at Ethan with an intensity that made his knees weak. Except you. Ethan blinked. What? The paramedics told me, Dante said. He held on to you. He wouldn't let go. You are the only person he has responded to. He walked back to his desk and picked up a piece of paper. He slid it across the mahogany surface. I have a proposition for you, Mr. Sullivan. Ethan looked at the paper. It was a contract. I need someone Leo trusts. I need someone to watch him, be with him, 24/7. I cannot trust my guards. One of them let him be taken. I cannot trust the nannies. They are spies or incompetents. I'm a waitress. I'm a waiter. Ethan corrected himself. I'm not a nanny. And I'm definitely not a mob wife. Dante's lip curled in dry amusement. I am not asking for a spouse. I am asking for a caretaker. He pointed to the bottom of the page. The salary is $10,000 a month, plus room and board here, plus full health insurance. Ethan's jaw dropped. 10,000. That changed everything. That was his debt paid. That was a new life. And if I refuse? Then you leave, Dante said coldly. And you go back to your diner, and your overdue rent, and your empty life. And you hope that the men who threw my son off that bridge don't find out that you are the witness who saw their car. The threat hung in the air. It wasn't a threat from him. It was a statement of fact. He was already involved. Why me? Ethan asked softly. Because you saved him, Dante said, his voice dropping to a whisper. And because I owe you a debt. A Valeni always pays his debts. Ethan looked at the contract. He looked at Dante, this dangerous, broken alpha. He thought of the little boy with the terrified eyes. He picked up the pen. I have conditions, he said. Dante raised an eyebrow. You are in no position to negotiate, Mr. Sullivan. I want no guns around the boy, Ethan said firmly. And I want to be able to leave the property on weekends. Dante studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Agreed. Ethan signed his name. Welcome to the family, Ethan, Dante said. The way he said his name, like it was a secret he was keeping, sent a shiver down his spine. Now come. Leo is waiting. The Valeni estate was beautiful, but it was a tomb. That was Ethan's first assessment after 48 hours inside. The walls, the floors, marble that chilled his feet through his socks. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of grandfather clocks that cost more than his entire life's earnings. His room was adjacent to Leo's suite. It was luxurious, a 4-poster bed, silk sheets, a bathroom with a tub the size of a swimming pool. The windows were made of bulletproof glass, and the door locked from the outside as well as the inside. He wasn't a guest, he was a high-paid prisoner. Ethan stood in the doorway of Leo's room. The boy was sitting on the floor, surrounded by untouched toys, Lego sets, remote-controlled cars, tablets. He was staring at the wall, rocking slightly back and forth. "Hey, Leo," Ethan said softly, sitting down on the carpet a few feet away. He didn't crowd him. He had learned that quickly. If he got too close, the boy flinched. Leo didn't look at him. "I brought you something." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, cheap plastic object. A fidget spinner, bright neon green. It looked ridiculous against the Persian rug. "Found it in my bag. Used to help me think when the diner got loud." He spun it. Whir. The sound cut through the silence. Leo stopped rocking. His dark eyes flickered towards the spinning green blur. "You can try it," Ethan said, sliding it across the floor. He stared at it until it stopped spinning. Then, with a trembling hand, he reached out and flicked it. It spun again. A tiny, almost imperceptible breath of relief escaped him. "Mr. Sullivan." Ethan jumped. A man was standing in the doorway. It was Giuseppe, the head butler, a severe alpha in his 60s with hair pulled back, so tight it looked painful. He looked at Ethan with thinly veiled disdain. "It's Ethan," Ethan corrected, standing up. "Mr. Valeni requests your presence in the dining room. Dinner is served." Giuseppe said stiffly. "Leo will eat in his room, as usual." "No," Ethan said. Giuseppe blinked. "Excuse me. Leo eats with his father," Ethan said, surprising himself with his own boldness. "He's terrified, Giuseppe. Isolating him isn't helping. He needs to know he's safe. Mr. Valeni prefers." "I don't care what he prefers. I'm the caretaker." Ethan walked over to Leo and held out his hand. "Leo, hungry?" The boy looked at his hand, then at the door. Then slowly, he stood up and gripped Ethan's pinky finger. Giuseppe's mouth formed a thin line, but he stepped aside. The dining room was a cavernous hall with a table long enough to seat 20. Dante sat at the head, a glass of red wine in front of him, reading a dossier. He looked up when they entered, his gray eyes widening slightly when he saw his son. "He's eating with us," Ethan announced, pulling out a heavy oak chair for Leo, right next to Dante, not at the far end. Dante looked at Ethan, then at the terrified boy. He slowly closed the dossier. "Very well." The meal was excruciating. Servants placed plates of roast duck and truffle risotto in front of them. The silence was suffocating. Dante ate with mechanical precision. Leo poked at his food, his eyes darting around the room. "So Ethan said, his voice echoing too loudly, "Does anyone want to talk about how the Bears are playing?" Dante stopped chewing. He looked at him as if he had just spoken in a foreign language. "I do not follow football." "Right. Of course. Too busy ruling the underworld," Ethan muttered under his breath, taking a sip of water. "I heard that," Dante said, though a hint of amusement tugged at the corner of his mouth. Suddenly, a loud clatter echoed through the room. Leo had dropped his fork. He froze, his eyes going wide. He looked at Dante, terrified, expecting punishment. Dante sighed, a heavy, tired sound. "It is just a fork, Leo. Pick it up." But Leo didn't move. He started to hyperventilate. The memories, the water, the violence, were triggered by the sudden noise. Ethan was out of his chair in a second. He knelt beside him. "Leo, look at me. Look at Ethan. You're safe. You're in the kitchen. No water, just air." Leo grabbed his shoulders, burying his face in his neck. And then he spoke. "Cold," he whispered. His voice was raspy, broken. "Daddy, cold." Dante froze. His wine glass hovered halfway to his mouth. He stared at his son, who was clinging to the hired help. "He spoke," Dante whispered. Ethan rubbed Leo's back. "Yeah, he did." He looked up at Dante, his blue eyes fierce and protective. "He's not broken, Dante. He's just freezing. And this house, it's the coldest place on earth." Dante set his glass down. The force of it nearly cracked the stem. He looked at the Omega kneeling on his floor, holding his legacy in his arms, challenging him in his own home. "Then warm it up, Ethan," he said, his voice low and intense. "That is why you are here." 2 weeks passed. The ice house, as Ethan called it, was slow. Leo was sleeping better, mostly because Ethan had started reading to him at night. Cheap comic books he ordered online, doing different voices for the heroes and villains. But while Leo was improving, the atmosphere in the house was deteriorating. Ethan felt eyes on him constantly. Not Dante's eyes, his were intense, calculating, but not malicious. These were different. It was the security team. Specifically, Rocco, the head of security. Rocco was a bulldog of an alpha who treated Ethan like a security risk. He checked his bags when he came in from the garden. He monitored his phone calls to his mother. One rainy Tuesday, Ethan was cleaning up the nursery. Leo was in therapy with a child psychologist Dante had flown in from Zurich. Ethan was picking up the Lego blocks when he noticed something odd about Leo's favorite teddy bear. It was a vintage bear, worn at the seams, but there was a new stitching line on the back, hidden under the vest. He frowned. He picked it up and squeezed it. There was something hard inside, not stuffing. He found a pair of nail scissors and carefully snipped the thread. He dug his fingers into the plush and pulled out a small black disc. A bug. A listening device. His heart hammered against his ribs. He knew enough from movies and from the vibe of this house to know this wasn't a baby monitor. He didn't run to Rocco. If a bug was in the nursery, security had either failed or they were involved. He marched straight to Dante's office. The guards at the door tried to stop him. "Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Valeni is in a meeting." "I don't care." Ethan shoved past them and threw the double doors open. Dante was standing behind his desk, flanked by 2 lieutenants. He looked up, fury flashing in his eyes at the interruption. "Ethan, this better be life or death." "It might be," Ethan said. He walked up to his desk and slammed the black disc down on the mahogany. "I found this in Leo's bear." The room went deathly silent. Dante looked at the device. His face didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He looked at his lieutenants. "Leave us. Boss." "Out." Dante roared. The men scrambled out. Dante picked up the device. He examined it with a terrifying familiarity. "It's a long-range transmitter," he said quietly. "Sophisticated. Not police. This is cartel tech." He looked up at Ethan. "Who has been in the nursery?" "Me, the cleaning crew, and your security team," Ethan said, crossing his arms. "Rocco checks that room every morning." Dante's jaw tightened. "Rocco has been with me for 10 years. And Judas was with Jesus for 3, Ethan shot back. "Someone put that there, Dante. Someone who knows Leo sleeps with that bear. Someone who wants to know where you are keeping him." Dante stood up and walked around the desk. He stopped inches from him. The height difference was intimidating. He towered over Ethan, but Ethan refused to back down. "You are accusing my head of security of treason," Dante said softly. "I'm accusing someone of targeting a 6-year-old boy," Ethan hissed. "And I don't care about your loyalty codes or your omerta. I care that Leo is safe. And right now, he's sleeping with a target on his back." Dante stared at him. For a moment, Ethan thought he might strike him or fire him. Instead, he reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind his ear. His fingers were rough, warm, and the touch sent a shock wave of electricity through Ethan's body that had nothing to do with fear. "You have good instincts, Ethan," Dante murmured, his thumb grazing his cheekbone. "Better than my men." "I'm just observant," Ethan stammered, his breath hitching. "You're dangerous," he corrected, "because you make me trust you. And I don't trust anyone." The moment hung there, thick with unspoken tension. The air crackled with a magnetic pull. Ethan found himself leaning in just a fraction. Dante's gaze dropped to his lips. Then the door burst open. It was Rocco. "Boss, we have a problem at the docks," Rocco barked, not noticing the intimacy of the moment or choosing to ignore it. Dante stepped back instantly, the mask of the Don sliding back into place. He swiped the bug off the desk and into his pocket in one fluid motion. Handle it, Rocco, and then come see me. We need to discuss new security protocols for the nursery. Rocco nodded, but his eyes lingered on Ethan. There was no warmth there, only calculation. As Rocco left, Dante turned back to Ethan. Go back to Leo. Do not leave his side. Do not eat anything that isn't prepared by Giuseppe personally. Do you understand? Dante, Ethan asked, his voice trembling slightly. What are you going to do? Dante turned to the window, looking out at the gray Chicago skyline. I am going to find the rat, he said, and I am going to exterminate it. The tension in the house broke 3 days later, but not in the way Ethan hoped. I have to go where? Ethan asked, staring at the suit hanging on his wardrobe door. It was a midnight blue silk tuxedo, sleek and tailored, with a cut that was both elegant and dangerously revealing. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. It also terrified him. The Valeni Foundation Charity Gala, Dante said. He was leaning against his doorframe, adjusting his cufflinks. He wore a tuxedo that fit him like a second skin. He looked like James Bond, if James Bond was a ruthless criminal overlord. I can't go to a gala, Dante. I don't know which fork to use. I'm a waiter from the South Side. You are Leo's guardian, Dante said, and Leo must make an appearance. Rumors are circulating that he is brain-dead or crippled. Our enemies smell blood in the water. We need to show them he is strong, that we are strong. So I'm a prop? Ethan asked, feeling a sting of hurt. No. Dante walked over to him. He took the hanger from his hand. You are his shield. He will not walk into that room without you. He made that very clear. Ethan sighed. He looked at the suit. Do I have to wear those shoes? Ideally. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel. It was a sea of diamonds, tuxedos, and fake smiles. Ethan felt like an imposter. The suit fit perfectly. Dante had guessed his size with unnerving accuracy, but he felt exposed. He held Leo's hand tightly. The boy was wearing a miniature tuxedo, looking adorable but pale. Head up, Dante whispered in his ear as they entered the ballroom, his hand resting on the small of Ethan's back, a burning brand of possession. If you look frightened, they will eat you alive. Who are they? Ethan whispered back through a smile. Everyone, Dante replied. The night was a blur of flashes and handshakes. Dante introduced him simply as Ethan, Leo's governess. He saw the looks the society wives gave him, judgmental, curious, jealous. He saw the looks the men gave him, hungry. Dante stayed close, his presence a dark barrier between him and the world. Around 10 p.m., the crowd parted. A man approached. He was older than Dante, with silver hair and a face that looked like it was carved from granite. Dante, the man said, spreading his arms. So good to see the boy is functional. Salvatore Moretti. Dante nodded, his body tensing. He is better than functional. He is thriving. This was Salvatore Moretti, the rival boss, the alpha Dante suspected of ordering the hit. Salvatore looked down at Leo. Hello, little one. You remember Uncle Sal. Leo shrank back behind Ethan's legs. Ethan stepped forward, placing himself physically between the old man and the boy. He's tired, sir. Back off. The room went silent. He had just told Salvatore Moretti to back off. Salvatore's eyes snapped to Ethan. He smiled, showing expensive veneers. And who is this spirited creature? He is with me, Dante said. His voice was low, but it carried across the room like a gunshot. Touch him, Sal, and we will have a war right here on the dance floor. Salvatore laughed, holding up his hands. Easy, Dante. Just admiring the help. He leaned in close to Ethan, his cologne overpowering. Be careful, sweetheart. The Valenis have a history of getting their people killed. He walked away, his entourage trailing him. Ethan was shaking. Dante turned to him, his eyes blazing. Take Leo to the car now. Rocco is waiting at the back exit. What? What? Because Sal just gave the signal, Dante said, scanning the room. We are leaving. Ethan grabbed Leo's hand and moved towards the kitchen exit. He moved through the crowd, heart pounding. He pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen. It was empty. Too empty. Rocco, he called out. The back door opened, but it wasn't Rocco. It was two alphas in catering uniforms, wearing ski masks. They held silenced pistols. Hand over the kid, one of them said. Ethan shoved Leo behind a stainless steel prep table. He looked around for a weapon, a knife block, a frying pan, anything. I said, give us the kid. The man lunged. Ethan didn't think, he reacted. He grabbed a pot of boiling stock off the stove and threw it. The man screamed as the scalding liquid hit his face. He fired blindly. Pop, pop. A bullet sparked off the metal table, inches from Leo's head. Ethan grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet as the second man aimed. He swung it with all the strength of an Omega who had carried heavy trays for 6 years. Crack. He hit his wrist. The gun skittered across the floor. Run, Leo, Ethan screamed. But the first man, face red and blistering, was getting up. He raised his gun at Ethan. Bitch, he snarled. Ethan closed his eyes, waiting for the burn. Bang. The shot was loud, unsilenced. Ethan opened his eyes. The man dropped, a hole in the center of his forehead. Standing in the doorway, smoking gun in hand, was Dante. Behind him, Rocco lay on the floor, bleeding from a knife wound to the gut. Dante walked over to the dead man and kicked the gun away. He looked at Ethan, covered in stock, holding a frying pan, standing over a traumatized boy. You, Dante said, breathing hard, are the most incredible Omega I have ever met. Rocco. Ethan pointed to the door. Rocco took a knife for me, Dante said grimly. He wasn't the rat. Dante looked at the kitchen staff entrance. The rat is still here, and he just tried to finish the job. He grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him and Leo close. The war has started, he whispered into his hair, and there is nowhere left to hide. The drive back to the estate was a blur of speed and silence. Dante drove the bulletproof SUV himself, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Ethan sat in the back, Leo asleep with his head on his lap. He stroked his hair, his hand trembling. The adrenaline from the kitchen was fading, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. When they arrived, the estate was already in lockdown. Floodlights swept the grounds. Men with assault rifles patrolled the perimeter. It looked less like a home and more like a besieged fortress. Take Leo upstairs, Dante commanded as soon as they entered the foyer. Lock the door. Open it for no one but me. Dante, your hand, Ethan said, noticing blood dripping from his sleeve. It's a graze. Go. He didn't argue. He carried the sleeping boy up the grand staircase, his heart echoing the heavy thud of his boots on the marble. Inside the suite, he engaged the deadbolts. He laid Leo on the bed and paced the room. The house felt different tonight. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was waiting. He needed water. His throat was parched from the smoke and screaming. The suite had a small kitchenette, but the pitcher was empty. He hesitated at the door, open it for no one. But the hallway was clear, and the main kitchen was just down the service stairs. He unlocked the door silently. The hallway was dim. He moved towards the service staircase, the one the staff used. As he reached the landing, he heard a voice. A whisper, frantic and hushed, coming from the laundry chute alcove. It's done. Rocco is down. No, Dante is alive. I can't. You promised no one would get hurt. Ethan froze. He knew that voice. It was Giuseppe. He pressed himself against the wall, straining to hear. I opened the service gate, Giuseppe hissed. The code is 734. Yes, the cameras are looped. Please, just don't hurt my grandson. You said you'd let him go if I planted the bug. Ethan's hand flew to his mouth. The bug in the bear. The bad feeling he had about the butler. It wasn't just dislike, it was intuition. Giuseppe wasn't a mastermind. He was a grandfather being blackmailed. But his desperation had just opened the front door to hell. They're coming now. Okay. A click. The call ended. Ethan didn't retreat to the room. There wasn't time. If the service gate was open, Salvatore's men were already on the grounds. The guards at the front gate were looking the wrong way. He turned and ran, not to Leo, but to Dante. He burst into his study. Dante was stitching his own arm, a bottle of whiskey open on the desk. He looked up, eyes narrowing dangerously. I told you to stay. Giuseppe, Ethan gasped out. It's Giuseppe. He opened the service gate. They're here. Dante didn't ask, are you sure? He didn't waste a second. He grabbed a heavy handgun from his desk and hit a red button on the wall. A siren began to wail throughout the house, a low, mournful sound. Get Leo, he said, his voice calm, terrifyingly steady. Go to the panic room in the cellar. Do not stop. Crash. The sound came from downstairs, glass breaking, gunfire. Too late, Dante growled. He racked the slide of his gun. They're inside. He looked at Ethan. For the first time, he saw fear in the eyes of the devil of Chicago. Not for himself. For him. Stay behind me, he ordered. If I fall, you pick up the gun, and you shoot anything that isn't me or Leo. Can you do that? Ethan thought of the boy upstairs. He thought of the alpha standing in front of him, bleeding for his family. Yes, he said. They moved into the hallway. It was chaos. The lights had been cut, the corridor lit only by the muzzle flashes of gunfire erupting from the foyer below. Leo! Ethan screamed, sprinting toward the bedroom. He reached the door. It was ajar. His blood turned to ice. He had locked it. Leo! He burst into the room. The bed was empty. The window was open, the cold November wind billowing the curtains. He ran to the window. A ladder was propped against the sill. Below, on the lawn, he saw two dark shapes dragging a small, struggling figure towards the tree line. Dante! He screamed, his voice tearing with raw panic. They have him. They're taking him to the river. Dante appeared beside him. He looked out the window, saw the figures, and his face went blank, a look of pure, unadulterated death. Stay here, he said. No. Ethan grabbed his arm. I can swim. You can't catch them in the water. Dante looked at him. He saw the fire in his eyes. The waiter was gone. The survivor remained. Move, he said. They didn't take the stairs. They went out the window, sliding down the ladder the kidnappers had used. They hit the grass running. Gunfire erupted around them. Dante returned fire, dropping a man who stepped out from the shadows. Ethan didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the small beige coat disappearing into the dark woods near the riverbank. They were heading for the boathouse. Salvatore wasn't just kidnapping Leo. He was going to finish what he started. He was going to drown the air where the river had failed the first time. Cover me, Dante yelled. He broke cover, drawing the fire of 3 men guarding the path. Ethan used the distraction. He ducked under the low branches of the weeping willows, sprinting towards the water. His lungs burned, his legs screamed, but he didn't slow down. He reached the boathouse just as the engine of a speedboat roared to life. The speedboat was untied, drifting away from the dock. In the stern, a massive alpha held Leo by the scruff of his neck. At the wheel was Salvatore Moretti himself, laughing into the wind. Too slow, sweetheart. Salvatore yelled over the engine's roar. Ethan stood on the edge of the dock. The boat was 10 feet away, 15. He didn't think about the cold. He didn't think about the bullets. He ran. He hit the end of the wooden dock and launched himself into the air. It was a desperate, impossible leap. His fingers scrabbled against the slick fiberglass hull of the boat. He slammed into the side, his ribs cracking against the railing, but he held on. He dragged himself over the gunwale, gasping. What the? The guard holding Leo turned. Ethan didn't have a weapon. He had rage. He kicked the guard squarely in the knee. The joint snapped with a sickening pop. The man howled and dropped Leo. "Get down, Leo," Ethan screamed. The boy scrambled under the dashboard. Salvatore abandoned the wheel, pulling a gold-plated revolver from his jacket. "You persistent little Omega." The boat swerved wildly, throwing Ethan off balance. He slid across the wet deck. Salvatore aimed the gun at his chest. Click. Misfire. Ethan scrambled for a flare gun mounted on the wall of the boat. He ripped it free. Salvatore fixed the jam and raised the gun again. "Goodbye, waiter." Ethan didn't aim for him. He aimed for the pile of spare fuel canisters stacked in the corner behind him. He pulled the trigger. The flare hissed through the air, a streak of red phosphorus, and hit the canister. Boom. The explosion rocked the boat. A wall of fire erupted between Ethan and Salvatore. The old Don screamed as the heat engulfed the rear of the vessel. "Jump, Leo." Ethan grabbed the boy. "I can't swim." Leo shrieked, paralyzed by the black water. "I can," Ethan yelled. "Trust me." He wrapped his arms around him, shielding his head, and threw them both over the side. They hit the freezing water. The shock was just as bad as the first time, but this time Ethan had a mission. He kicked hard, surfacing away from the burning wreck of the boat. Debris rained down around them. The boat was a floating inferno, drifting downstream. "Hold on to me," Ethan gasped, treading water. "I got you." From the shore, a spotlight hit them. Ethan squinted against the glare. Was it Moretti's men? Was this the end? "Ethan." The voice was rough, broken. "Dante." He was wading into the river, his expensive suit ruined, the water up to his chest. He reached out his hand. Ethan kicked toward him, his strength failing, the cold seeping into his bones, shutting him down. Dante grabbed his arm, pulling them both toward him, crushing them against his chest. He was shaking. The invincible Mafia boss was shaking. He carried them both to the bank. He collapsed on the grass, Leo sandwiched between them. "Is he dead?" Dante asked, looking at the burning boat. "He's gone," Ethan whispered, his teeth chattering. "It's over." Dante looked down at him, his hair matted with river water, his suit torn, his face bruised. "You saved him," Dante said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's my job." Ethan managed a weak smile. "It's in the contract." Dante laughed, a dry, rusty sound, but it was real. He leaned down and pressed his forehead against his. "Contract is void," he whispered. "Does that mean I'm fired?" "No," Dante said. He brushed a wet strand of hair from his face. "It means you're promoted. Permanent position." He kissed him, cold and wet, tasting of river water and smoke, but it was the warmest thing Ethan had ever felt. "Daddy." They broke apart. Leo was sitting up, wrapped in Dante's jacket. He looked at the burning boat, then at Ethan. "Did you explode the bad man?" Leo asked. Ethan hesitated. Yeah." Leo nodded solemnly. "Cool." Dante threw his head back and laughed, a sound of pure relief echoing into the Chicago night. 6 months later, the spring sun was warm on the terrace. Ethan sat with a book, watching Leo chase a new puppy, a golden retriever named Spark, across the lawn. The security was still there, but it was discreet now. The fear was gone. The glass door opened. Dante walked out. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing jeans and a black t-shirt. He looked 10 years younger. He placed a cup of coffee on the table and sat on the arm of his chair. "Giuseppe's trial starts today," he said quietly. "Did he take the plea deal?" Ethan asked. "He did. He gave up everyone in Salvatore's organization who survived the purge. He'll do 5 years in minimum security. His grandson is safe." Ethan nodded. Dante took his hand. On his finger was a ring, not a diamond, too cliché. It was a sapphire, deep and blue, the color of the river at night. "You know," Dante mused, looking at his son laughing in the grass. "I spent my whole life building an empire to leave to him. Money, power, soldiers. I thought that was what kept you safe." He looked at Ethan, his gray eyes soft. "I was wrong. It's not the soldiers. It's the person who is willing to jump in the water when everyone else runs away. Ethan squeezed his hand. Well, don't get used to it. The water was freezing. I know. Dante smiled, leaning down to kiss him. I'll keep you warm. Leo ran over, the puppy barking at his heels. Ethan, Dad. Spark dug a hole. They looked at each other and smiled. It wasn't a perfect life. It was still a dangerous world. But as Ethan looked at the two Valeni men, he knew one thing for certain. They would never drown again. 6 months became 9, and the Valeni estate transformed from a fortress of cold marble into something that actually felt like a home. The bulletproof windows still gleamed, the guards still patrolled, but laughter echoed through the halls now. Leo's high-pitched giggles, Spark's excited barking, and the low, warm chuckle of Dante Valeni when he watched his Omega son and his Omega mate chase each other across the manicured lawn. Ethan had settled into his role as Leo's guardian, and something more. He still didn't have a title, but everyone in the household knew that when Ethan spoke, it carried weight. He had earned respect not through fear, but through unwavering loyalty and a willingness to dive into freezing water for the ones he loved. It was late September when Ethan noticed the first signs. The nausea came in waves, always in the mornings, always accompanied by a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of coffee could cure. He brushed it off as stress. There had been whispers of Salvatore's remaining faction regrouping, and Dante had been spending long nights in his study, coordinating with federal agents and loyal lieutenants to stamp out the last embers of the rebellion. But then came the smell. Ethan, who had always been able to tolerate even the strongest aromas, deep-fried onions, old grease, the metallic tang of blood, found himself gagging at the scent of Dante's morning espresso. He nearly vomited when Giuseppe, now reinstated after a reduced sentence and a strict probation, served roasted chicken for dinner. Dante noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything about Ethan. Ethan, Dante said one evening, cornering him in the library after Leo had been put to bed. You've been sick for 3 weeks. You're pale. You're avoiding coffee. You fell asleep during a board meeting yesterday, and I don't mean a syndicate board. I mean the one about the charity foundation. Ethan opened his mouth to deny it, but a wave of dizziness hit him. He swayed, and Dante caught him instantly, his strong arms wrapping around him with a gentleness that still surprised him. Talk to me, Dante murmured, his voice low and rough with concern. Please. Ethan looked up into those storm-gray eyes, eyes that had seen death, betrayal, and violence, but now looked at him with something soft and terrified. He took a breath and said the words he hadn't dared to say aloud. I think I'm pregnant. Dante went absolutely still. For 3 full seconds, he didn't move, didn't breathe. Ethan felt his heart plummet. Maybe he doesn't want this. Maybe it's too soon. Maybe. Say that again, Dante whispered, his voice cracking on the last word. I think I'm. Dante kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It was fierce, desperate, full of a joy that seemed too large for his body to contain. He lifted Ethan off his feet, spinning him once before setting him down with trembling hands. You're sure? Dante asked, his forehead pressed to Ethan's. I need to take a test, but my body knows. I've been feeling it for weeks. I just didn't want to hope. Dante cupped his face, his thumbs brushing away tears Ethan hadn't realized were falling. You and Leo are my entire world, Ethan. If there's another life growing inside you, another piece of us, I don't have words for what that means. He kissed his forehead. We'll call Dr. Chun in the morning. We'll confirm. And then, his voice dropped, thick with emotion. Then we plan for the future. Ethan laughed through his tears. I can't believe I'm having a baby with the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago. Correction, Dante said, pulling him close. You're having a baby with the man who would burn the world down for you. And that baby will be the most loved, protected child in the history of this city. The test was positive, confirmed by Dr. Chun 3 days later. Ethan was 8 weeks along, healthy, and the heartbeat was strong. Dante sat in the examination room, holding Ethan's hand so tightly that his knuckles were white, staring at the ultrasound screen as if it held the secrets to the universe. "That's him," Dante breathed. "That's our son." "It could be a daughter," Dr. Chin said mildly. Dante shook his head, a rare smile breaking across his face. "No, I can feel it." Another Valenier. Ethan rolled his eyes, but he was smiling too. "You can't feel genders. Watch me." Dante leaned down and kissed his stomach, a gesture so tender it made Ethan's heart ache. "Hello in there, little one. I'm your father. I'm going to teach you how to shoot, how to swim, and how to never, ever let anyone push you around. Please don't teach our child to shoot before they can walk," Ethan said flatly. "I said how to shoot, not when." Dante's eyes gleamed. "There's a difference." The news spread through the estate like wildfire. Giuseppe, despite his checkered past, was the first to congratulate them, his stern face cracking into a genuine smile. "The House of Valeni will have another generation," he said, bowing stiffly. "May he, or she, be as brave as his other father, and as fierce as his sire." Leo was the most excited of all. He had been talking about wanting a baby sibling for months, ever since one of the guards brought his toddler to the estate. When Ethan gently explained that there was a baby growing in his belly, Leo's eyes went wide as saucers. "Can I teach him to throw a ball?" Leo asked. "Her," Dante corrected with a smirk. "It's a sister." "I think it's a boy," Ethan said, laughing. "We'll find out in a few months. And yes, Leo, you can teach him to throw a ball. But first, you have to teach him to walk." Leo considered this very seriously. "Okay, but I need Spark to help." "Spark is a dog." "Spark is a very good dog," Leo insisted. "He helps with everything." Ethan and Dante exchanged a look of pure, exhausted love. Their family was growing, not just in numbers, but in the messy, wonderful chaos that made life worth living. But the shadows of the past were never far behind. 3 weeks after Ethan's first trimester ended, a package arrived at the estate. It was addressed to Ethan, postmarked from a dead letter box in the south side. Inside was a single photograph, the hospital where Leo had been taken after the first rescue, with a red X marked over the nursery wing. On the back, a message scrawled in sharp, jagged handwriting. "You took one air. We'll take the new one." Ethan felt his blood turn to ice. He didn't panic. He had learned to suppress that reflex. But he immediately called Dante, who was in a meeting with the syndicate's legal counsel. Dante was at his side in under 10 minutes. He examined the photograph, the handwriting, the message. His face was a mask of controlled fury. "Salvatore's men aren't all dead," Dante said quietly. "Some of them are still out there, waiting for a chance to hurt us." He looked at Ethan, his eyes blazing with protective intensity. "You're not leaving the estate until I find them. Leo stays with you at all times. No exceptions." Ethan nodded, his hand instinctively moving to his belly. "What about you?" "I'll hunt them down myself." Dante tucked the photograph into his pocket. "But first, I'm increasing security. And I'm assigning a personal detail to you and Leo. Someone I trust implicitly." The next morning, a tall, sharp-eyed Omega named Marcus was introduced as Ethan's new personal guard. Marcus was a former military medic who had worked for the Valeni Syndicate for 5 years, and his loyalty was absolute. He was also, as Dante dryly noted, completely immune to bribery, threats, or seduction. "Good to know," Ethan muttered. Marcus cracked a rare smile. "I'll take that as a compliment, Mr. Valeni." "Ethan. Please call me Ethan." "Ethan, then. Let's start with a perimeter sweep." The weeks that followed were tense, but manageable. Ethan continued his work with Leo's therapy sessions, oversaw the household's daily operations, and spent long hours in the nursery. They were preparing for the baby, a soft, sunlit room with pale blue walls and a rocking chair that had belonged to Dante's grandmother. He tried not to let the photograph haunt him, but every creak in the floorboards made him tense. Every unexpected visitor sent his heart racing. Dante worked tirelessly, tracking down the remnants of Salvatore's network. He came home late most nights, smelling of gunpowder and exhaustion, but he always made time to press a kiss to Ethan's belly and murmur promises of safety to the child inside. One evening, Dante arrived home with news. "We found them," he said, his voice flat with finality. "The cell that sent the photograph. They were hiding in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. We moved in tonight." Ethan set down his book, his heart pounding. And, all neutralized, Dante's eyes were dark, but there was a weight lifted from his shoulders. "It's over, Ethan. Salvatore's line is finished. No one else is coming for us." Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around Dante, burying his face in his chest. "I was so scared," he admitted, his voice muffled. "I know." Dante held him tightly, one hand cradling the back of his head. "But you're safe. Leo is safe. And the baby," he pressed his palm against Ethan's belly. "This little one will never know fear. I swear it." They stayed like that for a long moment, the weight of the past months slowly dissolving. Then Ethan pulled back and looked up at him. "Let's get married." Dante blinked. "What? Marry me?" Ethan said, a smile spreading across his face. "I know we're already family in the syndicate sense, but I want it to be real. I want to say vows to you in front of Leo, in front of everyone who matters. I want to be your husband." Dante stared at him, his expression shifting from surprise to something raw and overwhelmed. Then he laughed, a full, genuine laugh that filled the room. "I was going to ask you this weekend. I had a whole plan. A ring, candlelight, a speech I'd been practicing for weeks." Ethan laughed too. "We can still do the speech. But right now, all I need is your answer." Dante kissed him, deep and tender and full of promise. "Yes. Yes, Ethan. I'll marry you. I'll marry you 1,000 times." Leo came running in, followed by Spark, who was wagging his tail so hard his whole body wiggled. "Did you say yes? Are you getting married?" Leo demanded. "Yes, little one," Dante said, scooping him up. "We're getting married. You're going to have a new daddy, officially." Leo cheered. Spark barked. Ethan laughed and cried, and felt the last of the shadows lift from his heart. The wedding was held 3 weeks later, in the garden of the Valeni estate, under a canopy of twinkling lights and autumn leaves. It was a small affair, just family, a few trusted lieutenants, and the household staff who had become like family. Leo was the ring bearer, carrying the bands on a velvet pillow with the solemnity of a young prince. Spark wore a bow tie and was determined to sit on the bride's side, Ethan's side, despite Dante's protests. Dante stood at the altar in a charcoal suit, his hair swept back, looking every inch the powerful Don. But his eyes were soft, fixed on Ethan as he walked down the aisle in a white silk jacket with a subtle lavender accent. The color matched the flowers that were everywhere, chosen by Ethan because they were the same shade as the Chicago sky at dawn. They exchanged vows under the canopy, their voices steady and sure. "I, Dante Valeni, take you, Ethan Sullivan, to be my husband," Dante said, his voice rough with emotion. "I promise to protect you from all harm, to cherish you in every moment, and to love you, not because you saved my son, but because you saved me. You taught me that power without love is just violence. You taught me that family is not a bloodline, but a choice. And I choose you, every day, for the rest of my life." Ethan's tears were flowing freely now. "I, Ethan Sullivan, take you, Dante Valeni, to be my husband. I promise to stand beside you through every storm, to bring laughter into your darkest days, and to love you, not because you are a Mafia boss, but because you are a man of fierce loyalty and hidden tenderness. You gave me a home, a son, and now a new life growing inside me. I choose you, Dante, and I will never stop choosing you." They exchanged rings, and when the officiant declared them married, Dante pulled Ethan into a kiss that was met with cheers, wolf whistles, and Spark's enthusiastic barking. Leo ran up and wrapped his arms around both of them. "I have two dads now," he announced. Dante laughed, lifting Leo onto his shoulders. "Yes, you do. And you're going to have a baby brother or sister soon. So you have to share." Leo nodded solemnly. "I'll teach them everything I know." "That's what I'm afraid of," Ethan murmured, but he was smiling. The reception was a celebration of life and love, good food, better wine, and stories that made everyone laugh. Giuseppe, despite his past, was accepted back into the fold, his loyalty proven through his cooperation with the authorities. Marcus, the Omega bodyguard, was given a seat at the head table as a mark of honor. At the end of the night, when the guests had departed and the garden was silent under the stars, Dante carried Ethan over the threshold of their master suite. Not because it was tradition, but because he wanted to. "Welcome home, husband," Dante said, setting him down gently on the bed. Ethan pulled him close, their foreheads touching. "It's been home for a long time," he whispered. "I just didn't know it until you." 3 months later, the baby arrived. A healthy alpha boy with a shock of dark hair and a cry that could pierce steel. They named him Giovanni, after Dante's grandfather, but they called him Gio. Leo was instantly obsessed with his new brother, reading him stories and showing him his favorite toys. Spark, the ever-faithful dog, guarded Joe's crib as if it were the most sacred thing in the world. Ethan held his son in his arms, watching as Dante cradled Leo beside him on the bed. The 4 of them, 5, counting Spark, were a family forged in fire, bound by love and unbreakable. "I used to think the river was the worst thing that ever happened to me," Ethan said softly. "But it brought me to you. It brought me to all of you." Dante leaned over and kissed his forehead. "The river didn't save Leo. You did, and you've been saving us ever since." Ethan smiled, exhausted and overflowing with joy. "That's my job, don't you remember? It's in the contract." Dante laughed, that warm, unguarded sound that had once been so rare. "Contract void, remember? Permanent position. Promoted to husband and father," Ethan said, looking down at Gio, who was blinking up at him with impossibly dark eyes. "Promoted to everything," Dante agreed. Outside the window, the Chicago wind howled, but inside the Valeni estate, the warmth of love held strong. The war was over. The family was whole. And the drowning was just a memory, a distant ripple in the black water that had led them all home.